Welcome back to the Infotagion podcast, the independent COVID-19 fact-checking service recommended by Ofcom. This is the first major public health crisis in the age of social media disinformation, and we're here to try and make sense of it. I'm Damian Collins MP, co-founder of Infotagion, and today we're joined by Karen Kornbluh, who is the director of the Digital Innovation and Democracy Initiative at the German Marshal Fund of the United States of America, who previously served in the Obama administration as US Ambassador to the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. Alongside Karen is Mark Scott, Chief Technology Correspondent at Politico Europe, and we'll also be hearing, as always, from our resident experts, the disinformation analyst Dr. Charles Creel and John Quinlan, the CEO of Iconic Labs. In this podcast, we'll be talking about the sources of COVID-19 disinformation and the response of the big tech companies to the crisis. So if I could come first to you, Karen Kornbluh, perhaps you could, before we start talking about disinformation and the work you've done there, perhaps you could just explain a little bit to listeners about what the German Marshal Fund of the United States does and how it was set up.
Yes, of course, I'd love to. Thank you. The German Marshall Fund of the United States is based in Washington, but we have offices throughout Europe as well. And the purpose of the institution is really to strengthen and support transatlantic relations and also democracy and democratic values. So when I was looking to set up an institute, an initiative that would be dedicated to how technology, as it continues to roll out, could support democracy rather than undermining it. That's exactly where I wanted it to be. And the German Marshall Fund is very supportive of it. They already had a program that you probably know of, the Alliance for Securing Democracy, run by Laura Rosenberger, which has been very successful in talking about foreign interference in U.S. election. And so I was very happy to join them.
Well, as you say, I mean, it does great work in fostering transatlantic cooperation, working in Europe and from its home in Washington. And in fact, the last time we met was at the German Marshall Fund in Washington in early February, which now seems like a sort of more than a lifetime ago, and so much has happened since then. But one of the things that has happened since then is the publication of your reports written with Ellen Goodman on safeguarding digital democracy. And I was very interested to look at that, in particular in the context of COVID-19, because the report rightly states that a lot of the sites that you've looked at, a lot of the channels for disseminating disinformation through the web have also been engaged in disinformation around COVID-19 as well as on other subjects as well.
Yes, one of the things that COVID has really clarified is that disinformation is a matter of life or death. I think when it was about, only, and I'll put that in air quotes, elections, there was some doubt about how important it was. Can marketing, advertising really sway an election? Can it make that much of a difference? But I think we're seeing in the COVID case, because we're aware that in the public health context, what happens at the margins can make such a big difference if you don't have people following the rules. And what we've seen over the last few weeks, with the last few days even, with this video pandemic that we've had in the U.S. with millions of views, people refusing to wear masks because they think that they're dangerous, harassment of doctors. We really see the cost of disinformation. What we wanted to do with our report, which, as you say, we were working on before the pandemic, we felt that there was so much fantastic research coming out, and it was helping people to understand there was a serious problem, but they didn't know how to absorb it all. It was almost like the research that comes out about nutrition. Should I not eat fat or not eat carbohydrates? I don't know what to do. We wanted to make sense of a lot of that research and put it into a context of, okay, what can we do about it? Because we felt that where policymakers and also average citizens were being forced was into this false choice of, well, who should do more censorship, the platforms or the government? And we thought, if you look at the research, what you see is that the platforms in their policies and their practices and their design allow disinformation campaigns to manipulate users, to trick users. And we wanted to show that. And then out of that comes some really natural policies. And Ellen Goodman, who's a media law scholar, wonderful co-author, I really relied on. We put together, because the two of us have a background in policy and law and the media and consumer protection and other areas, what could you do about it?
Absolutely. And before we come on to talk about some of the solutions, which you in the report, which I'd like to talk about as well, I think you made a good point about the pandemic film, which many people will be familiar with, having seen it in the last week or so. And this is something we've talked about in the podcasts in recent weeks, is that in the past, when we've talked about disinformation campaigns, we've often talked about foreign actors and Russian interference and things like that. But a lot of this is being produced from within our own societies as well. People who maybe have been misled themselves, who then share disinformation, or even some people who are creating it and using social media to boost the audience for that.
Exactly. This is a great example of that. So I've worked on internet policy since before the Clinton administration. I was at the Federal Communications Commission and at the Treasury Department working on internet policy during that administration. And in the early days of the internet, there was this great hope in California and Washington, in Europe, that the internet was going to be, by its design, pro-democracy, pro-transparency, give voice to the voiceless. And it did in many ways. But the internet has changed quite a bit since then. And the platforms are now our media gatekeepers, but they don't have any of the obligations of our old media gatekeepers. And a lot of the protections that were put in place in the broadcast era to ensure that users were not manipulated, that there was transparency about who was paying for something, that there was both sides were given an opportunity to speak up. A lot of these are not present in the current situation, but it's more easy to manipulate people because you can do this micro-targeting. You can flood the zone with networks of your fellow travelers or through bots. So there's great opportunity to manipulate, but very little obligation to help the user, to empower the user to understand. And when we see one of these marketing campaigns, these sophisticated marketing campaigns, like happened with this pandemic video, where it's very nicely produced, where they use this outlet, the Epic Times, to promote it, where they develop where they increase the visibility of influencers who then promote it, where they have large networks of folks on Twitter, some of whom may have been bots. They're using YouTube videos and then they're using Facebook groups that may have tens of thousands of participants. It's extremely sophisticated, and it's very hard for your average viewer to understand what's happening.
Absolutely. And I think the size of the audiences is obviously a key thing, because if we were talking about a relatively niche media, then alongside the questions about how you create rules of the road for it would be a debate about, well, what's the extent of the harm being done because the audience is small. But we're talking about media channels that, in terms of the eyeballs and attention that they command, are more popular than many broadcast television and radio networks. And there are standards and rules that have to be set. But in this media, there aren't. And you couldn't get away with doing some of the things you can do on social media in terms of creating bogus films or fake facts and spread them, because there are regulators that would intervene and do something about it.
Yes, and of course you can't do exactly what you had in the early days of broadcast. I mean, we can't even do on broadcast what we did in the early days of broadcast, because there's a multiplicity of outlets, and we don't want regulators deciding what's indecent or what's true and what's not true. But we certainly could have rules about much more transparency about who's paying for outlets, about what's coordination. And we could have obligations on these platforms that are, in effect, acting as curators for the content. So the way we separate it out is There's the content, and in this pandemic video, you see the YouTube, you see the book that she did, the memes, the articles maybe in a Gateway Pundit or an Epic Times. Then you see the distribution, and that could be through Facebook pages and groups that are dedicated to anti-vax or the QAnon theory, or don't want to have the closures for the pandemic. And then you have the moderation. And moderation, I think, is something that we're not really always as focused on, that the platforms don't only moderate when they take things down. Their algorithms moderate what you see in your newsfeed, what you get as your recommendations on YouTube. They're programming what you see just as much as a broadcaster may be programming what you see on their channel. But they're not responsible for that, and they're doing it based on engagement, outrage, not based on information. Sometimes that's the opposite of information, actually, what will make you more engaged and stay online so that you can receive more ads. And then they do moderate sometimes after it's gotten, so that happened with the pandemic video, after gotten huge play, they may take it down, but it's already done the damage. And they're not super transparent about why they moderate. Often it's only after the news media has embarrassed them. So that adds to a feeling of conspiracy. So I think what we focus on are three things. One is we have to reduce the noise of disinformation and the manipulation through a lot of things that are sort of transparency plus. We have to increase support for journalism, and we have to have some accountability on this moderation function. And so, for instance, does it make sense if you have groups on Facebook in the tens of thousands that you have no responsibility for what's going on in them, even when they're private groups and no one can see what's going on in them?
I think that's a really important point, because I think Facebook in particular, say in response to coronavirus disinformation, that they make it hard to find, that if you search for information about coronavirus, you'll be more likely to get trusted sources. But of course, most people's experience of social media is not searching for content, it's having content played to you. Which is selected by the algorithm, and therefore it's perfectly right that we should ask the companies to be responsible in how that algorithm works.
Exactly right.
If I could bring in Mark as well. Thank you for joining us from Politico. I mean, the issue around disinformation is obviously very important for consumers. This is a life and death issue to make sure we get the right information we need about a public health emergency. But it's also been a very challenging time for news media as well, at a time when we've never needed accurate information more readily. And I wondered if you could give us your perspective at Politico in terms of how well you think the tech companies have responded to this crisis, and as a news organization, how easy do you find it to work in this environment?
Thanks, and thanks for having me. Not to be the politician on the podcast, but I would say the platforms have done both a good and bad job on during the pandemic. Good in the fact that they've gone further than I ever thought they would have in terms of taking things down. So for years, they have said, we are a neutral platform. This goes to Facebook, Twitter, and Google, YouTube, excuse me. But as of February, they took quite extensive steps to take down a lot of harmful content. And to Karen's point, this stuff was frankly life or death. So, they have to be given credit for that. The problem being is that the box has been opened, and it's very difficult for now to shut it. And so you don't have to scratch very far, both to your point, Damian, about searching for content on Facebook, but also through everyone's Facebook feeds to find a lot of quite awful things out there. So you have a variety of far-right and extremist groups trying to use COVID to promote their own messages. You have the proliferation of groups dating back to the 2016 US presidential election who have become quite sophisticated in their use of social media, both the mainstream ones like Facebook and Twitter, and the more radical fringe ones like 4chan, 8chan, Reddit, etc. And what I would suggest is that the pandemic is sort of the sweet spot, if that's the right way to put it, of all these efforts coming together in terms of the networks are there, the content's there, the conspiracy theories are there, the global effects are there, and all it needed was the pandemic to come along and to light the touch paper, if you will, to get everything going.
I think that's right. And I think what's happened as well, I'd be very interested in your views on this, is that I think the public awareness of disinformation it built on the back of Cambridge Analytica and investigations into Russian involvement in the 2016 US election. But I actually think, this is now a much more mainstream issue for people. Disinformation around, a virus that could affect you and your family is a much more urgent matter. And I think I wonder whether this is why the tech companies are responding more, because it's not just about outrage from the media or from politicians, but this is actually what consumers are really worried about.
I think so. And when you have people torching telecom masts all across Europe because they think 5G spreads coronavirus, you can see how this has become sort of a question of the here and now, not of the future. And we must be clear, though, that the majority right now, as long as we can calculate this, of the disinformation out there is coming from grassroots or domestic actors. Right now, the Chinese and Russians, although they are there, and the Iranians are there, part of the discussion, the majority of this is coming from domestic groups. And therefore, the question now comes: how do you deal with that? To Karen's point, there's some very good policy questions that need to be asked. And I suppose as a journalist, I'm all about free speech. But when does free speech become harmful? Right? You can say what you want, but you can't put people at risk. And as a journalist working through this, it's very concerning for me to see a potential automated takedowns from the platforms in terms of getting rid of content, because everyone should have the right to say what they want to say. The problem being is right now that some of that stuff is putting people lives at risk. And there is a very difficult conversation that we need to be having about what role do the platforms play. Right now, I would suggest that most governments have outsourced this to these private companies. And that's a conversation that frankly isn't being had. And second of all, when it comes to getting the right information, to Karen's point, the promotion of good information is important. And I think the platforms are still struggling to come to terms with how do you both demote content that is harmful, but also how do you promote legitimate newspaper copy, if you will, and frankly pay publishers for that. That's an ongoing live discussion right now.
But I suppose that one of the big differences with publishers is that you put your name on what you do. Ultimately, it's clear who's written it, who's the publisher. There are people that are taking responsibility for it because that's part of the publishing code. But with disinformation on social media, I think we need the help of the tech companies, because they're in some ways the only ones that can really see what's going on, because a lot of it is being posted by people we don't really know who they are, or it's difficult to trace. But I wanted to just touch on something you said there as well about the content originating from within our own society, which we talked a little bit to Karen about. And Karen, in your report, you highlight in particular the role of amplifiers of disinformation. Do you think there's a risk that although a lot of fake content is being created and posted by people within our own societies, its audience is being generated by external actors who are sort of boosting and sharing stuff they see which favors their worldview or a conspiracy theory they might be trying to promote themselves?
Yeah, I mean, I think what you two were just talking about in terms of free expression and needing to protect it is highlighted by the fact that we're not only talking about foreign interference, we're talking about domestic actors, and sometimes we're not talking about bots. We're also talking about real humans acting in a really coordinated way, and it makes it very important to not just reach for the censorship tool, to not just ask, have the government ask the platform to take it down, because when do we step over into harming our democratic values, harming our free speech? But you also hinted at some of the things we can do when you talked about the lack of information about who an outlet is, who an actor is, how they're acting behind the scenes. There are so many loopholes that the platforms have left that allow these players to manipulate users and not to give them that information. So, my son called me the other day and said, "What is this Epic Times? I'm getting all these ads." So if people understood, that this is this shadowy group, it's related to the Falun Gong in China, they would be a lot less prone, I think, to believe what they say. Similarly with Gateway Pundit or some of these other outlets, they're allowed to sort of arbitrage our trust in mainstream journalism online by looking like mainstream journalism, but not providing any of that metadata, as you will, that the old outlets provided us. They had a masthead. They separated opinion from news. They had a byline. You could find out what their codes and standards are. None of that is available in these outlets. So that's just an example of where we don't have to go to any kind of freedom of expression concern if we can just give users, in a way they can understand it, some information about who's talking to them.
Thank you. And if I'd just like to bring in now our two resident disinformation watchers, for people who are familiar with the podcast, Charles Creel and John Quinlan. Charles, if I could start with you, what's caught your attention since the last podcast?
Thanks, Damian. I've been paying a lot of attention to the issue around children and children getting coronavirus. Early in the pandemic, lots of folks promoted the notion that children don't get COVID-19, or at least they don't suffer from it as badly, or that they could get it, but that they were only asymptomatic spreaders. So as with most things, there's been a lot of confusion about this, particularly early on, and people could be forgiven for that, given the kind of mixed messaging that's out there as well. So at the beginning of March, looking into this, we see that Alison Pearson, a columnist for The Telegraph, who just today, in fact, tweeted that COVID-19 poses almost no risk to working age people, earlier wrote that coronavirus doesn't infect children. Even the Director General of the World Health Organization said that relatively few cases are seen in children. And Time magazine, just in April, said that if there's one glimmer of hope in this entire pandemic in the past few months, it's that young children seem to avoid more serious illness. But not everybody is convinced, and the story is changing quite quickly. Denmark reopened their schools and daycares in April, and many parents there resisted. They were afraid of a second wave of infection, and some were quoted in the World Economic Forum questioning why their children should be used as guinea pigs. Shortly after those schools opened, Denmark's R number actually rose from 0.6 to 0.9. But now there are reports of a new diagnosis in children that have begun making their way into the press as of a couple of weeks ago, and has been made official in the past few days when New York Governor Andrew Cuomo spoke at a press conference about a mysterious inflammatory illness linked to coronavirus that has killed at least 3 children in New York. New York officials have said they're investigating 2 other deaths possibly linked to it, which present symptoms that are similar to both Kawasaki disease and toxic shock syndromes, but they're also monitoring 85 possible cases, mostly in children between toddler and elementary school ages. Now, is this coronavirus? Officials believe that it is, but it also could be a secondary infection. But the symptoms are very similar. The impact is incredibly deadly, and the spread seems to be increasing. So the answer is yes, children do get coronavirus. Children do spread coronavirus. And even though it may present itself differently, the impact is just as severe and just as tragic.
Thank you, Charles. I mean, I think obviously people are so much more sensitive to news around how children can be affected or not affected by these things. It has also sadly also been a topic for some of the disinformation stories we've looked at as well. And I mean, John, perhaps you could give us a bit of an update as to what we've been seeing at Infotagion itself in the last few days.
Yeah, as always, Damian, it's always pretty interesting to see what we've got coming in. We usually get a variety of stuff. I think the main one we've had in the last couple of days is actually around a very simple question, which is, can UK patients be forced to take a vaccine? This is something that we've seen in the US more so before, this idea of civil liberties being affected, but alongside a few protests over the weekend in London, we're seeing this story of a YouTube video purporting to be quoting from the Journal of Medical Practitioners and stuff like that, making a claim that UK patients can be forced to take a COVID-19 vaccine against their will. Firstly, of course, there is no vaccine at the moment, and secondly, mandatory vaccination is prohibited in the UK. But I think it just shows the theme that we're seeing around civil liberties, and we certainly have seen that the protests both echoing what's happening online, like, protests offline, echoing what's happening online, but also affecting what's happening online as social media reports on it, and it kind of goes from there. In addition to that, just sort of slightly lighter perhaps in the last 24 hours on social media in particular, less on Infotagion, but more on social media, is the reaction to Boris Johnson's press conference, which has created a lot of activity. I'm sure everyone's WhatsApp groups and Facebook feeds and Twitter feeds have been filled with. I'm seeing a lot of satire. There's a particularly good one from Matt Lucas, star of Little Britain, who makes makes a humorous angle on a very serious point, which is I think there's been some lack of clarity in the government's advice, or that's certainly the view of social media.
In fact, the BBC even played the Matt Lucas spoof of Boris's speech in full on The World at One on Radio 4.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's very good, but I think he was questioned a little bit in the comments about whether he can, whether he should be making sort of, fun, inverted commas, of such a serious subject. But his point was that satirists are there to actually, make a point as well. And and as Karen and Mark brought up the issue of free speech, that's also perhaps one good thing about that. The platforms that we've got with the social media reach and amplification, that something like that has become so popular so quickly.
I mean, Karen, satirists have had quite a lot of fun with President Trump's remarks on coronavirus, particularly around disinfectant. I mean, obviously he has his own style, but do you think the leaders do have to be very careful about what they say, not just because of the risk of satirical response, but also to make sure that what they're saying is true and accurate?
Absolutely. And I think what's so interesting about the current situation is that the scientists that I think everyone wants to rely on are learning as we go. And so what's coming from them is changing, and what's coming from our leaders it should necessarily be changing as well as they learn more and as the situation evolves. But that's hard for folks to absorb. And so ideally, there would just be a great deal of explaining of the situation and educating of people. And I think we saw that really well with that whole business about flattening the curve, especially in the United States. Folks aren't super sophisticated about math. And people really started to understand and got the picture about flattening the curve because there was so much explanation about it. But since then, I think there's been, as was pointed out, some sense of, the scientists are tricking us, or they're wrong, you can't trust them just because they're learning on the fly and the information is changing. What we should have from our leaders, and we often see, is them emphasizing that we have to listen to the experts. But when they start undermining that, then we get into big trouble.
I think that's right. And Mark, do you think from a news point of view that one of the problems with this is that if we had constant list of clear, simple, straightforward facts that the government could communicate to people about this very dynamic, very complicated situation, then that would be a good way of combating disinformation. But actually, sometimes there's a lack of clarity even from the experts and the official sources.
What's the expression? Sort of the first draft of history can be messy. I think it's very difficult in the situation where things are changing so quickly, and even the scientific advice from, say, 2 months ago has shifted rapidly. I feel that we're in, it's quite cliche to say we're in a post-truth world now, but I think right now, particularly with the life and death situation, when it comes to getting accurate news and information to individuals, I'm concerned that as this goes on, and frankly, if we look at a vaccine being developed by early 2021 at the earliest, we have another 6-ish months, if not longer, to go before we have any type of solution or way out of this. So what is the world going to look like when people are already now starting to question the experts in terms of going outside, what remedies to take, etc.? My concern is, say, in 2, 3, 4 months' time, that trust will even become even less than we have now. And then the conspiracy theories, the protests we're seeing in, say, some of the US state houses with guns, etc., becomes more pronounced. and heaven forbid leads to potential violence. I mean, that would be the worst case scenario. So when it comes to politicians and frankly the press, we have to be very careful about what information we give to individuals, and be willing to say we got this wrong and correct the record as soon as possible to make sure that people do get the right information as soon as they can.
I think you're right in the timings. I mean, it could be a while before there's a vaccine, and indeed, I think it was Neil Ferguson, the historian, said in his Sunday Times column this weekend that if you look at things like HIV/AIDS, we still don't have an effective vaccine or antiviral treatment. So these things can take a long time. And of course, even if we do get to the case of having a sort of vaccine for coronavirus, I'd imagine there'll be a huge battle to be won over the anti-vax movement, who will probably try and spread disinformation about whether it actually works or not, or causes other harms.
And we're seeing that already happen. I mean, the anti-vax movement, which is quite pronounced in the US, Italy, and France, have already taken this and are pushing these. So we are not going to do this, as in take the vaccine wherever possible. And there is some sort of coordination going on already. So you can imagine that once the vaccine is in place and you need a certain level of uptake to have the herd immunity, that is going to be a significant public health information debate to be had. And my concern is that if we don't retain the trust of individuals, both through traditional outlets and from politicians, as well as through social media, that is a conversation that's going to be significantly more difficult to have, say, come November, December, or early 2021.
Absolutely. We'll keep us pretty busy at Infotagion in trying to analyze the disinformation and provide accurate feedback for people who use our site. But that probably brings us towards the end of our discussion. So Mark, Karen, thanks so much for joining us. And it's great to have you, Charles and John, once again on the podcast.
Thank you. Thank you for all you're doing.
Thank you.
Thank you. You've been listening to the Infotagion podcast, hosted by me, Damian Collins, featuring Karen Kornbluh, Mark Scott, Charles Creel, and John Quinlan. It was produced by Lucy and David Dargahi. You can find out more about Infotagion and send us examples of disinformation you've seen by visiting our website, infotagion.com, or using #IsolateTheLies on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Thank you until next time.